Hey everybody, welcome back to Video So today I got a really fun and exciting episode for you guys this Friday, and it's one that I've wanted to talk about for a very long time because I get a ton of questions. We're going to talk about what it's like to collect arcade boards, whether or not you should jump in, where you should jump in, and the different types of arcade board standards and non-standards you're going to find out there. Because once you get into arcade collecting, two things are certain. You're going to fall in love with it and want a lot more boards, and you're going to be having issues and trouble the entire way trying to figure out exactly how everything works. So I'm going to just basically spell that out for you here today. Before we get too far involved, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But the first type of board we're going to talk about, and where I recommend everyone starts out, is a JAMMA board. This is a standard. It's basically plug and play so long as you're not dealing with light gun games or driving games. If you want to buy a JAMMA fighting board, you're basically going to just be plugging one thing in and you're going to be off to the races. And we will go over stuff like superguns and everything like that in just a moment, but JAMMA is the entry point for pretty much every arcade collector. You can get a supergun, plug it into a monitor, and you're basically going to be able to play a game with any sort of controller you want adapted over and be perfectly fine. But you're definitely going to need a supergun if you don't have an arcade cabinet, because most people start collecting bare PCBs and going from there. Something like the Haas here, the 5.0, which just came in, is a very nice supergun that sometimes sold out, sometimes not. What a supergun does is it adapts the JAMMA signal over to different breakouts, so you have your video, you have your controls, different test and service buttons, as well as power in, so you can play an arcade board basically sitting on your table without the need for an entire arcade cabinet, because trust me, once you start getting those things, space becomes a very big premium. We'll see on this one here, it's got a mini DIN breakout for RGB, as well as DB15 ports, which is pretty much the Neo Geo standard of controllers. I definitely recommend you start somewhere on the DB15 spectrum. It just works really easily that way. You'll also see there is an audio out. Now on this other side, if you're not familiar, this is the female JAMMA Edge. This is basically just a cartridge connector here with a ton of different pins, but there's something very particular about JAMMA you need to know, which pretty much every first time user makes this mistake at least once. JAMMA is a keyed format. You can plug it in the right way and be totally fine. If you reverse the JAMMA hardness and plug it in the wrong way, you're going to release the magic smoke from the board. You'll see here, connecting this supergun, this is the correct way to do it, so we would be perfectly fine if we ran it like this. And that is why I recommend for all new arcade collectors on the JAMMA side of things to get in a JAMMA extension harness, one that does have a key blocker inside of it. Also, this keeps the mechanical strain on the JAMMA Edge on your arcade board as well as the supergun down to an absolute minimum, because you'll see here we have the male and female ends of JAMMA, and if we take a look here, we have that key slot that you need to be able to insert, and on this harness here there is a blocker within that key. That means this only will go on to the male JAMMA Edge in one direction. If you try to do it in reverse, you're going to be physically blocked there and you cannot insert it. So you'll see here, if I take that same board, I can put this JAMMA harness on and it's going to slot in because there's that missing section of the PCB there, the key. If I accidentally or inadvertently try to plug this in the wrong way, sending 5 and 12 volt power to the wrong pins, it is physically impossible for me to insert this connector the wrong way round. This is why I always recommend to make sure that your JAMMA hardware is keyed so you cannot plug it in the incorrect way. Now, as far as superguns are concerned, there's two ways to power them. This basically uses an arcade power supply that's going to deliver 12 volts, 5 volts ground, and negative 5 volts as well, because negative voltage on some arcade boards is important. You'll basically have to Google the name of the game and go from there. But you can also get superguns that use an ATX power supply. You don't want to bring too much of a voltage though, because you don't want to starve the 5 volt rail. The Silverstone works for me, but you need to make sure the supergun has a negative 5 volt auto gen on it, because a PC power supply is not going to give you that negative 5 volts. It's just not part of the overall spec, so this is something you need to make sure on. And this again is why I recommend that extension harness here. You will see whatever I do with the supergun when I move it around, it's not really putting any strain on the extension whatsoever. Do not connect your supergun directly to the arcade board unless you're sure you're not going to strain it. And on the control side of things, because it is just DB15, what I recommend, you can kind of just adapt anything over. DB15 is a dumb standard, so it just means it is a physical connection, ground and signal to get your voltage. But now let's move over to something different. This is a JAMMA board, but I kind of call it JAMMA Extra, JAMMA Plus, whatever you want to use. There really is no standard acronym. That is because we're doing everything over the JAMMA Edge, except the video is going to come across a VGA port, so it's kind of JAMMA and kind of not. But this again is still a very easy standard, even if it's not a standard to deal with, because as long as you have that supergun, you're doing everything and then just hooking up a VGA cable. And you'll see here on my RetroTink 4K, this is reporting as VGA 640 by 480, kind of close to a Dreamcast spec right there. So sometimes on JAMMA boards, you're going to find that even though you have the JAMMA Edge, certain things are going to come across different connectors. On this Arcana Heart PCB, all of the video comes across VGA, where all of the sound and all of the controls, all of the power are going to be on JAMMA. And you'll just see here that we do have that little VGA connector, so you will see in some instances that JAMMA boards do have different video outs or other control ports in, like kick harnesses for Capcom CPS and CPS2. Or something like the Atomiswave, you can kind of use all across JAMMA to get a signal out, or you can also start using VGA ports and different stereo connectors. So this would be considered a JAMMA board as well as almost a JVS board, but not quite. And do be aware that some of the more advanced JAMMA boards will have their own expansion IOs here. On Atomiswave, you have this entire cartridge that plugs in, so sometimes your inputs won't be coming across JAMMA. What I want you to understand is JAMMA as a standard continues to grow, and there are some weird stopping points along the way. Take something like this Konami ZR107 board here. It is entirely a JAMMA board, down to the controls, down to the power, all of the inputs, including analog controls, except the video comes across a completely different connector on a completely different board. And if you're not aware of this and you purchase this game, you're going to plug JAMMA in, hit power, and you're going to think the board is dead because there's absolutely no video coming across it. You would have to see here, you have the whole JAMMA Edge, and you would think that you would get video on it because that is how JAMMA works, but there's actually a subboard on this, and this connector right down here is going to carry the RGB signal as well as power and ground for any sort of video out, and this can definitely trip people up. Or something like the Python 2 here from Konami. This is just a big PlayStation 2 in a box, and it has a JAMMA Edge, but honestly you're barely going to be touching that whatsoever. It might make it seem like it's JAMMA, but when you actually take a look at the IO board, it's going to be wildly different. But this is kind of why I love collecting these weird boards. Not only do you get a full fat PlayStation 2 in a box, you get to play Thrill Drive 3, which is an amazing game that you can only play on the Python 2. So if you take a look at the front, power is going to come in on its own connector. There's going to be a specialized connector for the analog controls, steering, gas, as well as brake. You're going to have an RGB port out that's going to bring over 240p or 480p video, and you're basically just using the JAMMA Edge for the start button and a few other inputs like test and service. So basically this is JAMMA with a whole other host of ports on it. So what I want you to really take away from this is, if you see any other ports other than that JAMMA Edge, you're probably going to have to connect something to it. And if you want to do light gun games, of course you're going to have a CRT television, and those light guns generally do not plug into the JAMMA Edge. Because here's the thing about the JAMMA standard, it was a standard until it wasn't. As games got more complex and they added more features and control schemes, developers and designers of the hardware would use the JAMMA Edge for a lot of things, and then add on connectors to basically expand its capabilities. So if you're looking for any sort of JAMMA game, just look it up and see how it's connected to see if you need to do anything different. Now moving on to my favorite thing to collect, and the thing I don't recommend you start with, the totally random arcade game. This is not JAMMA, this is not JVS, this is not PC in a box. Whatever the engineers had for connectors that was cheap the week they designed this board is how it hooks up. This is a Silent Scope board which is going in a box and shipping to somebody else very soon. You get to an era in arcade games where basically they just put on whatever connectors they had, and it is a fully bespoke design based upon that generation of hardware and can even change game to game. This uses completely different power plugs, audio, video in, as well as all of the control connectors on these pins right here, so it can be basically anything. They can also pivot JAMMA to become this totally random input depending on what they wanted to do. They would basically use a JAMMA design, expand on it with a filter board here. This is Lucky and Wild, and you will see at the top we have this ribbon cable connector coming off of what would be a JAMMA Edge, and on the right we have a JST connector coming in for power. So power is being delivered from one source, and all of the controls, video inputs, and otherwise, including audio, are coming off of this PC cable style connector, but if we take a look at the back of the filter board, we're going to find out that it is JAMMA with a secondary connector bringing some of the other signals across. So while this does have part of the JAMMA standard, it pivots it to something completely different, therefore it is going to be on the totally random side of how you hook these things up. So you're going to want a manual with a wiring diagram, and you're going to have to get very good at creating new harnesses or hooking things up creatively. That's why I'm saying that this is not where I recommend to start. Something like Operation Tiger here, one of the rarest arcade PCBs I own. I absolutely love the game. It is a total blast to play. It is that classic 90s 3D arcade light gun jank that I know, love, and remember from back in the day. But I will tell you right now, it's an absolute pain in the ass to actually deal with, because this has multiple different connectors, that PC ribbon cable, as well as just the standard pinouts here, and everything needs to be adapted to some sort of conventional format for you to both control the game as well as play it in your house. So you'll see here we have that PC ribbon cable. I did a full tutorial on how to do this, and I basically had to adapt everything across, reverse engineering the pinout with the manual to be sure that I was connecting absolutely every signal correctly. You put power into the wrong pin, you're going to have a very bad time. This is the type of situation in which one mistake is going to fry a board. So I adapted it over to JAMMA in a custom control setup, and this is something that you need to learn how to do if you want to collect these boards, and why I recommend you do not start in any way, shape, or form at the totally random category, because I had to work back from the manual to create a JAMMA conversion harness just to get power, audio, video, and some buttons out. The rest of the buttons I had to pivot over to a flight stick and custom modify that as well, just so I could actually control the game, because it was an XY potentiometer light gun game, not a raster sensor. I love converting these games, but I can't recommend enough, if you've never purchased an arcade PCB in your life, do not start at the totally random category. I get a lot of messages from people that bought their first arcade board of a game they loved from back in the day, and they have no idea how to make it work. Now moving on to a new standard, JVS. This is an extension of JAMMA. It basically modernized the JAMMA standard to be more expandable and to support more features in more modern games. This is obviously the Sega Naomi, and this is going to be a JVS standard. When I say JVS standard, that means you're going to have JVS power in. So if you have a power adapter that goes to either an arcade power supply or an ATX to JVS converter, you're going to be able to plug it into pretty much every JVS board out there. On the Naomi side of things, you also have a VGA port out as well as RCA stereo. And you'll see at the top there we have a USB-A port, which is not a USB protocol whatsoever. It's just using the port to get in your JVS I/O board. I use a Tucson Logic, which I've shown off in videos before, but JVS has control inputs across JVS versus JAMMA, where all the controls would go into the JAMMA edge. This is a little bit smarter of a connector. Just be aware that you do need some sort of JVS I/O board, and not every single I/O board will be compatible with every single arcade board. You need to check. But honestly, JVS, not my favorite thing in the world. Let's talk about the boring kind of arcade PCB, the PC in a box. This is a Taito Type X2. It's got a ton of fun games. You can get a lot of multis for these things. It is a fun place to start, but honestly, it doesn't really feel super like arcade collecting to me, because if you have a PC, you basically played with this format before. The only difference is that you have a bare metal case versus a nice PC design, and you also either have JVS or fast I/O input, so your inputs aren't coming across a USB port, they're coming across a different board. But this is a very easy place to start. If you can hook up a cable to a GPU, if you can hook up an audio cable to one port, and if you can plug in power, you're going to be able to get an image on your television and the game will be running. The only thing you need to do is plug in that JVS I/O board, whichever one you choose, and adapt your controls over to it. I like using my custom arcade stick, so I just made an adapter here to take a DV15 pin signal and go into the pin headers on that I/O board. But again, this isn't the most exciting realm to collect for, but it is another easy one if you want more modern stuff. Taito Type X2 or X3 is definitely for you. They're very easy. But here's the thing about actually collecting arcade hardware of any size, shape, or form. If it is not listed as working, it's probably broken, and even if it is working, inevitably it's going to break at some point in time. You need to get good at repairing things. Do not expect to collect arcade hardware and have it 100% work every single time. Now, you don't need to get as deep into restoration as I do here. I love doing this. I'll bring in boards that I think I can fix, and more often than not I can. And just a note, no, I do not repair arcade boards boards for other people unless they're incredibly rare and I'm interested in them. I get a lot of requests to repair hardware, and I can tell you right now, I don't have the time unless I have a fascination for the board. But you're going to have to learn how to use a multimeter, you're going to have to learn how to solder, and you're going to have to learn how to research and Google things, because a lot of times the problem you're dealing with might not be apparent. You're going to have to hunt for somebody who dealt with it 10 years ago. And all of these boards have caution labels on them telling you not to take them apart and not to electrocute yourself with them. But every single arcade PCB should come with a big caution label. You're going to lose a hell of a lot of money doing this, because collecting arcade PCBs is a more money than common sense situation, but I absolutely love doing it. And that's the thing, this is completely different than collecting retro gaming consoles or handhelds. This is the final frontier as far as I'm concerned, and I love it. So maybe if you've never done it before, grab a JAMMA board or something like a Taito Type X2 multi. From there you'll probably move on to JVS, and before you know it, you'll be reverse engineering custom arcade boards so you can play them at home. Because for a lot of these games, the only way to play them is still the real hardware, because they don't emulate. So that, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, leave them down below, but we're done and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.